Of course you're going to need your battery that you're going to replace. You're going to need a cross-point screwdriver. You're going to need a small pair of needle nose pliers. And you're going to need a standard straight blade small screwdriver. If you don't have any tools, the cheapest way to purchase tools is to go over to Harbor Freight Tools. You can purchase your tools there. If you don't want to buy import tools, you can go to your big box stores like Lowe's or Home Depot, and you can purchase a little bit higher quality tools. For example, I like Cobalt tools, and I like the Husky tools at Home Depot. They're very nice tools, good quality. They have a lifetime warranty. Nice quality tools, very cheap. So the first thing we need to do is remove the cover to where the battery and controller are located. If you look on the left-hand side of the e-bike, you'll notice the plastic cover here. At various points around this cover, notice this is your charge plug right here. You'll notice there's little rubber plugs at several points. We're going to need to take the small screwdriver and we're going to have to gently pry out these plugs. These are basically to keep moisture and water out of the screw area. So what we need to do is take our little screwdriver, and sometimes these are a pain to get out. You want to try to get underneath the screwdriver on the edge and try to pry that out. And you may have to even come in, take your needle nose pliers, pinch it and pull the plug out. Once you take all your components out, get yourself a little container, coffee cup, paper cup, whatever you have. Take your parts and put them in the container. That way you won't knock them off your workbench, you won't lose them. When it comes time to put everything back together, you'll know right where the parts are. Now, as you're taking things apart, disassembly and reassembly can sometimes be complicated. So what I do is I use my cell phone, and not so much in the case of taking the cover off, we know how that is, but if you're disconnecting wires, removing components, always take a picture of the parts or parts and how they're assembled, how the wires are connected. That way when you go to reassemble, all you have to do is look at your pictures and you'll be able to tell the proper assembly of those components. Even I, at this point, if I'm taking something apart, I will snap a lot of pictures because, again, a couple days later, a couple weeks later, you may forget how things go back together, and then you have to guess, or then you have to go do some research. So it's always a safe idea to take pictures of your disassembly so that when you go back to put it back together, you know exactly what goes where and how all the wires connect. So let's go ahead and pull all the little rubber plugs out from the cover. Once you have all the rubber plugs, you want to now take your cross-point screwdriver and you want to start removing all the screws. Doesn't matter where you start. As the screws come out, put them in your container. Hold that panel with your hand, remove the final screw. Now when you remove the cover, be very gentle because your charging plug is going to be connected to this cover. So when you pull it down, just gently let it rest on your workbench. So now we've exposed underneath the cover. This is your motor controller right here. this is the battery right here. Really, inside of an electric bike, it's very simple. You have a controller to control your speed, regulate the voltage and current coming from the battery, and that then supplies the current through these wires here to the motor. So at this point, what we want to do is we want to loosen, there's 2 screws here. Now before we do that, if you're going to purchase a different battery from the one I have, you want to make sure to measure this battery, the overall length, the height, and the depth. You want to get a battery that's going to fit inside of these clamps and properly fit within the space that they've provided. So in this case, I've tried to purchase a battery that is exactly the same size, or in this case slightly smaller. So what you want to do, there's several options, and I'll go over those options here in a little bit on what you can purchase and where you can purchase your batteries from, depending on how comfortable you are purchasing from overseas. And what you want to do, measure everything in millimeters or centimeters, because a lot of the batteries, even on Amazon, their specifications are given in millimeters. So in this case, I have a Milwaukee small tape measure that has both SAE measurements and metric measurements. In this case, we have a battery that has a length of about 20 centimeters or 200 millimeters. It has a depth of 7 centimeters or 70 millimeters. And we have 8.5 centimeters or 80.5 millimeters. So you want to write those numbers down, and that way when you go to order a battery, you want to keep within the dimensions or slightly smaller. Now there is a battery out on Amazon that meets the qualifications of the specifications, except that it's a little bit thicker. This was about actually 70. Well, actually the battery on Amazon will fit. So there's a couple different places. Again, we'll get into where you can purchase the batteries and the different options for purchasing batteries. So at this point, we've written down our measurements. Now what we can do is there are 2 Phillips head or cross-point head screws at the top. The top 2 screws are loosened. Now we want to get the bottom 2. But there's one word of caution. When you loosen the final screw, the battery's going to want to fall out. We still have to disconnect the battery from the controller and from the charging port right here. So as we loosen this, we want to make sure we catch that battery before it falls. We don't want to damage these wire connectors. Remove the clamp. We can set that off to the side. Hold that battery in your hand. Now if you notice, there's a little connector right here. Now we can remove the cover safely and set it off to the side. the wires coming from the battery. Looks like there's an unused harness connector right here. And that's very uncommon. A lot of these controllers have different features that aren't being used. So you may see some wire connectors that aren't connected to anything. So what we're looking for here is we're looking for a red and black connector that goes to the controller. Now it looks like they've used some zip ties here to hold all these wire connectors and harnesses together. So I was trying to find the wire without cutting those zip ties, but we're going to cut the zip ties so we can get at that connector. It appears to be buried in this bundle. Don't worry about it. Very easy to disconnect and to put back together. We're going to cut the zip ties. Now, as you notice, when we unravel the wire harness, the battery is connected to a yellow and black connector. This connector is called an XT60 connector. The 60 refers to the amount of amps that this connector can carry. So as you see here, we now have a loose battery. We can now grab onto the leads and we can now disconnect that XT60 connector. Now the nice thing about these connectors is one side is flat and the other side is round. If you'll notice, the red wire is connected to the flat side. This way you can't plug your wires in backwards and burn out your motor or controller. So at this point, we can now set the battery off to the side. The current video is getting a bit long, so we're going to split this up into several sections. So thank you for watching the first part, and we'll see you in the next video. While we're looking at batteries here, let's talk about different options that you have. I've purchased this battery from eBay from a Chinese vendor. Now, I purchased a lot of things from Chinese vendors, and I personally have not had a lot of issues with purchasing from China. I've had some issues where they've sent the wrong product, or the product was damaged because it was not properly packed. But in all cases, just communicating with the vendor, they've either sent me the correct part, or they've sent me a replacement if the part was damaged or defective. Now again, I've heard some horror stories out there of other people having issues, but I purchase a lot of things directly from China, and I've had really good luck doing so. Also, a lot of these vendors who sell on eBay, there's a buyer protection program provided by eBay, so they don't want to get a bad rep through eBay. So the consumers who purchase on eBay can give feedback, positive, neutral, or negative. And if they get too many negative feedbacks, then a lot of people will not purchase from them, or if they're shady, eBay will basically remove them from the site. So again, they have to, in order to maintain being able to sell on eBay, they have to have a good reputation. So again, personally, I've had not a lot of issues with purchasing from vendors. But again, if you're not comfortable, there are some other options. Amazon sells 36-volt e-bike batteries, and I've looked on the Amazon site, and a lot of these vendors are Chinese vendors, but they have warehouses here in the US, and so they ship directly from their local warehouses, or they have Amazon fulfill the shipment of the items. So again, whatever you feel comfortable with. So let's get back to the battery replacement videos. In looking back at what I just accomplished, it would be far easier before removing the battery to disconnect or cut the zip ties first, locate the wires, disconnect the wires, and then unscrew the battery. So again, this is the first time I've done it. So see, everybody can learn by doing things. So in the future, when you do it, make sure you cut your zip ties, disconnect the cables first, and then remove your battery. What we want to do now is just do a quick trial fit on our battery. Even though I measured this, we want to come in and we want to find the best position for the battery. Notice the wires coming from the battery are mounted on the bottom, or if you're looking at the writing of the label, the wires are on the top. So in this particular case, we can either mount the battery like this, but what I would do is I'm thinking of the charging cable here. So what we want to do is we want to put this, because originally on the standard battery the charging cable came underneath the battery, and then your battery connector goes up into the harness this way. So this is the position on how I would mount the battery. That way we can run the charge cable underneath the battery and connect it, in this case, to the charging connector. As you notice here, the charging connector has a different connector on it. It has a small connector with 2 pins in it. The connector on the replacement battery has a 3.5 millimeter barrel connector. So you'll notice that we have an incompatibility here. This is where the soldering is going to come in. Well, there's 2 ways we can do this. We can order a 3.5 millimeter connector and wire that and solder that into your charge connector, or we can cut this connector off and we can solder on this connector onto these 2 wires right here. So there's a couple different options you can do. In both cases, though, it's going to require some soldering on your part. So we can clip the connector off and solder this connector on, or we can go purchase a barrel connector and solder that male side of the barrel connector to the 2 wires here, and then we'll have a proper connection to the charging port. Just depends on which way you want to do it. In both cases, you're going to need to do some soldering. I'm sure you've seen these barrel connectors before. They're on a lot of battery adapters that you plug into your house current. It converts it to direct current, and then all you do is plug it into your device. So a barrel nut, and you can purchase these on Amazon with just bare wires at the end. Barrel nut basically goes in, makes the connection, and then you can easily plug it in and disconnect it. So that's one option. Just go on Amazon, purchase yourself one of these 3.5 millimeters, and then you can solder that connector into your charging wire. Or you can cut off the barrel connector on this end and solder it to these 2 wires. Now, I don't have a barrel connector that's not connected to an adapter. So what I'm probably going to do is I'm going to snip this barrel connector off and solder it onto the existing charge cable and connector. That way I don't have to purchase another item. Let's talk about the other 2 wires on the battery. As we mentioned, the Jetson bike has an XT60 connector that mounts directly to the controller. This particular battery has this red looking connector, and if you look very closely at the end, one pin is horizontal, the other pin is vertical. If you look at the color coding of the wires, the positive or red wire is in the horizontal position. The ground or negative wire is in the vertical position. Now, the nice thing about this connector, and this connector is called a Deans connector, D-E-A-N-S. Amazon sells, for very inexpensively, a Deans to XT60 adapter. So you don't even have to make one up. You can go on Amazon and purchase. Now what you need is you need the male end of the Deans and you need the female end of the XT60. So how this works is when you order this from Amazon, and I'll put the links in the description, you basically plug that in. Let me reposition the camera now so you can see the other end. So once we get the adapter installed, all we have to do is find the male end of the XT60 connector. Again, one side is circular, the other side is flat. We take the two ends, line them up properly, and we've now made a connection from the battery to the controller. So in this particular case, all you need to do for the battery connectors is purchase yourself a Deans to XT60 connector. Now, you have to be cautious because Amazon sells both male and female versions of this connector. So you want to make sure you have the female XT60 connector and the male Deans connector. Now, Amazon sells a set of both male and female swapped, so you can either purchase the one you want or you can purchase the set, so you make sure that if you made a mistake you'll get either or you'll get both. So in this case the battery is going to be an easy conversion. We just purchase the adapter and we plug it in. A little more complex step that we have to do is we have to do a little bit of soldering over on the bench to change the charge port connector in place of the barrel connector. So we'll go over to the workbench here and I'll show you how we're going to solder this. We have our original battery pack here, the one that we're going to replace. Notice on the charging cable we have the little black connector. One wire is red, which is your positive. One wire is black, which is your negative. So what we want to do is we want to separate these two wires, and we want to come back about 2 inches. We want to take our side cutters and we want to snip the wire at about 2 inches. And we do not want these two wires to touch, even though the battery may be dead. You don't ever want to short out a battery. You could cause a lot of heat and some sparks, so always keep these two leads. So now what we have is we have our black connector with some extra length on the wire. Now we're going to take this connector and these wires and we're going to splice it and solder it onto the new battery pack. So let's just set this off to the side for now. Now on the new battery we have our bullet connector, and if you notice the wire is black. One side there's a striped white line and the other side the wire is all black. Okay, in this particular case, the striped wire is your positive, the black wire is your negative. Now you want to get yourself a little X-Acto knife, and which I've already done this, but what you want to do is take your X-Acto knife and very gently come in between the two wires to split these two wires so you can pull the wires apart. Because if you would come along and just cut like that, chances are you would short out the battery. So you want to separate those wires so when you snip them, there's no risk of shorting out this battery. Shorting out batteries is not good. It can cause sparks, and it could damage your battery, and it could burn you. So what we want to do is separate those wires. Again, we want to leave ourselves about 2 inches of spare wire, and then what we want to do is we want to come in, snip the one side, and snip the other side. Okay, now the goal is to come in and then splice in the white striped wire to the red and the black wire to the black wire. And in order to do that, we have to expose some bare wire on both ends of the wire pairs. So let me show you how we're going to do that. This is the end of part 2 video. In the next video, we'll continue on with our battery replacement. Hope you would like the video, and thank you for watching. I've done another video that explains how to prepare wire for soldering, the different types of tools that are needed. I'll put a link at the end of this video on that points toward that video. You might want to go ahead and watch that before you attempt to do your own battery replacement, because it goes into the proper ways of soldering, the proper tools to use, and it will set you up and prepare you for this particular task. So this is a common type of wire stripper that you can find at big box stores and things like that. This is a more of a specialized stripper that you can purchase on Amazon. Either one will work fine. The wires that we have here are 22 gauge, and the best way to tell is just look at the stripper, put your wire, and I'll show you how to strip the wires. And again, my other video goes into how to distinguish wire size, and which is commonly referred to as wire gauge. So watch that video. It will educate you a little bit on wires and how to prepare them and solder them. When I strip wire, I like to use this style of stripper. It automatically adjusts to the thickness of the insulation and then strips the wire. So what you want is at least a 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch of bare wire when you strip. You place the wire in between the jaws, and then you come down and you just squeeze the pliers, and if you notice, the insulation comes off. Again, we want 3/4 of an 1/2 inch, 3/4 of an inch. And I always like to twist my wires. These wires are stranded. There's a bunch of little strands underneath the insulation. Now, coming to our battery, and we always want to keep these wires separate when we're working on them. This is a live battery. I've measured it. Static voltage is 36 volts, so you do not want to touch those two ends. What I do is take the wire, pull them gently apart to get some distance between the ends of the wire. And again, using our stripper, we want to come in and strip off 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch of wire. And again, I like to twist them and do not touch the ends together. So we have the wires of both the connector and the battery stripped. Now we're going to splice them together and we're going to solder them. I'm going to show you how to do that. If you don't have a soldering iron, you can go over to Harbor Freight, and for $5 you can pick yourself up a really nice soldering iron that will solder wire up to 12 gauge. Now, I've tested this. It works really nicely for soldering wire. It does a great job. The other thing that you're going to need is some rosin core solder. If you go over to one of the big box stores like Home Depot or Lowe's, do not get the acid core solder that the plumbers use. That is not good and will mess up your electronics projects. In this case, you don't want to use that on a battery either. So pick up some rosin core solder. It comes in different sizes. When you're doing wire, it doesn't really matter if you get larger or smaller. Just get a nice little roll of some solder. You don't have to have fancy equipment like I do. Go get yourself a dish sponge and cut a little tab. And what you want to do is you want to wet this sponge. You're going to use this sponge to clean the tip of your soldering iron. Again, watch my video on soldering and using soldering irons. It will educate you quite nicely on how to work with soldering and wires. So before we plug the soldering iron in, we want to clear a spot on our desk here to work. We don't want a lot of clutter there. We want plenty of room so we don't burn ourselves or melt things around us. The soldering irons get very hot. They can get 700 degrees really easily. So clear your desktop, make yourself a nice space to work in, but we aren't going to plug in the soldering iron just yet. We're going to do some prepping first. You're going to need some heat shrink tubing or a little bit of electrical tape, your choice. I like to use heat shrink tubing. It's easier to work with, holds better than electrical tape, but again, if you don't have any around or you don't want to buy any, then just use a little bit of electrical tape. Before soldering, if you want to use heat shrink tubing, you want to put the heat shrink tubing on the wire and push it as far away from the splice as you can, because when you apply the heat it will shrink. So what I like to do is split my wire a little bit more, push it back. If you want, you can use different color heat shrink tubing, and a lot of people will use red on red, black on black, or not, as long as you're able to distinguish the wires before you solder them. So push your heat shrink tubing on. If you're using electrical tape, you can electrical tape the splices after you're done soldering. At this point, we have the heat shrink tubing on. Now you always want to make sure that you find that white striped wire. That is your positive or red. So at this point, what you want to do is you want to put the wires together at an angle, and then you want to twist the wires together, and you want to get the wires as smooth as you can without any of the little strands sticking up. Because if they stick up, it will prevent the heat shrink tubing from being able to slide over the splice. So I really like to make sure that I get this really smooth of a connection here. See, and then if you want, you can even take and you can test sliding your heat shrink tubing over the splice to make sure that it will slide properly. And again, push that as far away as you can, because the minute heat hits that, it will start to shrink and then you'll be in trouble. So you only want that to start shrinking when you're ready for it to shrink. Again, keep your wires separate, double check and triple check to make sure the white stripe goes to the red and the plain black wire goes to the black wire. At this point, what we're going to do is we're going to splice the other side. And again, we cross the wires and we wrap the strands around the wire to form the splice. Again, tuck in those little strands so that they don't stick up. because if they stick up, you're not going to be able to get your heat shrink over the wires. Notice, see, I can't get that heat shrink over there because the little ends are sticking up. So really twist them tight to make sure the wires are joined together really well. And see, now I can slip the heat shrink over the wires. Now I have something which is called a third hand. You don't need one, but it does make wire soldering easier. They're very inexpensive. You can purchase them on Amazon, or you can just get yourself some alligator clips and make your own. So what I do is I hold the wire that I'm going to solder in the third hand, and that way the wire won't jiggle on me or move around. At this point, we can heat up our soldering iron. When your soldering iron is hot, you want to take a little bit of solder and you want to coat the end of your tip with it. Have a little ball form. That will help heat the wire and solder it much quicker than if you start out with a dry soldering iron. Now what we want to do is we want to take the soldering iron with the little blob of solder, hold it onto the wire, and let the wire get hot. As you can tell, when I touch the solder, when it's hot enough, the solder will flow very nicely over the wire. And what you want is a nice, shiny splice. If the solder is dull and crusty, it's not hot enough. So you want a real shiny splice. Same thing when we're ready. Take a little bit of solder, put it on the end, come to your other wire. You want to heat up that wire, and when it becomes hot enough, the solder is going to start flowing on the wire. That's it. Both of the wires splices are soldered. Now let's let it cool. We don't want to slide the heat shrink tubing over until the wires have cooled down. Otherwise it will start shrinking before we're ready for it to shrink. So just touch it lightly with your fingers. Make sure that the wires are cool. Then we'll slide the heat shrink over the splice of the wire. After the wire is cool, we just then simply take the heat shrink tubing and slide it down over the wire. You may have to jiggle it, you may have to bend it a little bit, but if you've done it right, you'll be able to slide the heat shrink tubing over. Now what we want to do is take our soldering iron and we want to shrink that heat shrink tubing. And the best way to do that is just take your soldering iron and gently rub the tip over the heat shrink. And that will shrink the heat shrink down over the splice. At that point, we are done with our soldering. We can take the charge connector from the cover and we can do a test. And we now have our connector working. We now can install the battery pack and the cover back on the e-bike. This is the end of part 3. In the next video, we'll finish the battery replacement on the Jetson Bolt Pro. Hope you enjoyed the video. We'll see you next time. Let's wrap this thing up. When you purchase a new e-bike battery, they usually come with a charger as well. For example, look at your output. It's 42 volts DC 2 amps. The original charger that came with the Jetson was the same output, 42 volts, but it was 1.5 amp. In that case, it just charged a little slower. In this particular case, they recommend using the 2 amp charger, so I would use this. In a pinch, you could also use the standard one that came with your Jetson. It just takes slightly longer to charge. In looking at inside the housing, you notice there's a taller mounting point. That's for the actual cover. you look off to the right, you'll see a shorter mounting point, both up and down on the cover. These shorter mounting points are for the battery bracket. And if you look at the one that is square, goes to the rear on those shorter points. Let's go ahead and mount one side of the bracket. We'll mount the top side, and then we can slip that battery in. Then on the other one, we'll mount the offset bracket with the shorter side down at the bottom and the wider side up at the top. We'll leave the brackets loose at the beginning, and then as we get the battery in, then we can tighten them up tighter. Now there is a little bit of slot play in the brackets, so that's why we're going to mount them a little loose, and we can reposition the brackets around the battery. If you notice, there's a little bit of a gap between the brackets on the newer battery, and that's because the newer battery is thinner than the original battery. So what we're going to do is we're going to get some probably little blocks of wood, little blocks of styrofoam, and then we'll try to block up that battery to keep it from moving. Then we'll tighten up the screws. In test fitting the battery and the cover with the new replacement battery in, I found out that one piece of 1/8 inch foam at the rear and 3 pieces of 1/8 inch rubber in the front made the battery really secure, and then allows the cover to go on. With more pieces on this side, it bulged out too much for the cover to fit properly. So if we put the more pieces of rubber in the front, and then we can put the cover on. Notice that the cover now snaps on and is snug on all of the mounting points. So you want to make sure you get your rubber pieces more to the front, less to the rear. Otherwise, this will bulge too much and interfere with the cover fitting over the battery brackets. Well, holding on to your e-bike, I put the old battery underneath the kickstand. That way I could lift the tire up off the ground and safely spin the wheel without the e-bike getting away from me. And it looks like our battery install has been successful. Remove the battery. Let's set the bike back down on the kickstand. Now that everything's been tested, we can go ahead now and zip tie up the wire bundles and put the cover back on. what I'll probably do is, I don't like these loose wires right here, so I'll probably zip tie this back, and then we can tuck that in, put the cover back on. Let me get a small zip tie. At this point, we're ready to put the cover back on, and we can go riding. So hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions about replacing the battery on your own e-bike, put a comment down in the comment section and I'll be more than happy to answer the questions for you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. What I've done is I've added a cantilever style bike rack. It mounts with a quick disconnect here. This style of bike rack has an adjustable platform that you can slide in and out. So you can adjust this for your needs. So for the time being, we're just going to leave this loose. One thing you're going to have to do is take off the rear reflector from the seat post, because this will interfere with the bike rack. So let's just go ahead and move that. What you can do is get yourself another reflector and put it on the rear of the bike rack. What you're going to need to mount an external battery to the Jetson is you're going to need your battery. You're going to need a piece of foam. You're going to tape that to the battery. You want to cushion that battery as you're going over bumps. We have some wires and connectors here. I'm going to put everything down in the description on what you need. We're going to show you how to mount this external battery. Now what I've done already is I pulled the cover off. I've cut the zip tie from the wire harness up front, and I've disconnected the XT60 connector from the controller to the battery. Very easy. You can watch an earlier video I did. I'll put that link in the description or in the video, so you can check that out. Now let's go ahead and talk about what we have to do to mount this external battery and wire it in to the existing battery on the Jetson. What we're going to do is take this is a Y connector, has XT60, it has a XT60 connectors. It has a male connector at one end, and then it Ys out into two female XT60 connectors. So what we can do is we can wire this into the battery, and what this is a parallel connector. What a parallel connector does, this connector allows you to wire two batteries in parallel, which will give you 36 volts, a combination of the amp hours between the standard battery and the battery that you purchase to externally mount to the bike rack. So we're not increasing the voltage, but we are increasing the amp hour range by adding another battery. Let's take a closer look at the wires coming from the controller and the battery. As you see here, the yellow portion of the XT60 connector, and again, XT60 connectors allow you to wire in connectors, and they only go one way to prevent you from damaging your battery. The flat portion of the connector is connected to the red wire or positive wire. The black wire or negative wire is connected to the round side of the connector, so it only goes one way. The other connector going to your controller is also an XT60 connector, and it's the male side. So what we want to do is we want to take our Y parallel cable and we want to plug the female side into the connector that goes to the controller. Again, it only goes one way to protect your battery. Then what we want to do is find the other connector, which is the yellow. We want to take one lead of the parallel Y cable and we want to connect it into the battery that is mounted inside the cover of the Jetson. Okay, so now what we have is we have one wire connected, or one connector connected to the battery, And then we have the other connector which we can run back to the battery that we're going to mount on the bike rack. Let's take a look at the external battery that we're going to mount. It has a charge cable, and it has your positive and negative leads coming from the battery going to what is referred to as a Dean's connector. And if you look really closely, one lead or pin on this connector is horizontal and the other connector is vertical. This also prevents hitching the connector the wrong way. If you notice, the horizontal connector is connected to the positive. In order to make the connection between a Dean's connector and an XT60 connector, they make an adapter. And again, I'll put all the hardware that you're going to need in the description. So what this connector is going to allow us to do is connect the Dean's connector to the battery, and now we have a female connector to the battery that we can now tie in to the connector, the Y connector we just connected to the controller and the battery. We're also going to need some wire, and I like to purchase the silicone insulated 14 gauge stranded wire. I'll again put a link of everything you need. The other two things that you're going to need are XT60 connectors, male and female end, and we're going to solder these onto the wire, and I'll show you where this wire is going to go. What I've done is temporarily put the external battery up onto the bike rack. Now, we have to make an extension cord between the Y portion of the connector that goes from the controller through the wire we're going to make to the XT60 connector on the external battery. So what we're going to do is, on the other connector, we need a male connector. It's going to plug in to the other end of the parallel Y connector. We're going to solder that onto a length of red and black wire, and then we're going to run it to the other XT60 connector on the battery. And now what we can do is we can cut a length of wire that comes in red and black, or positive and negative, between this connector and that connector. And if you look on the rear portion of your battery case on the Jetson, you'll notice there's a cutout on the actual plastic case. You'll also notice that there's a cutout here on the front side of the plastic cover. We're going to run the wire through this connector space here between this connector, through this hole, and up to the connector on the external battery. And what we're going to do is, when we do that, we're going to zip tie the wires to the bike rack and the seat post area, and then down through this hole here that we can route the wires through. Another thing that you're going to need for your battery that you mount to the bike rack is you're going to need some type of a waterproof bag, canvas, plastic, whatever. That way you can take the battery, you can put it inside the waterproof bag, again like a small canvas, waterproof canvas bag with a zipper on it. That way when you want to charge this battery when you're not riding, you can remove the battery, you can disconnect the XT60 connector, connect your charger, and then you can charge this battery. You can also charge the battery on your bike separately. So It's always a good idea. Again, I took and I cut myself a piece of rubberized foam mat. I had this lying around, so I cut a short strip. We're going to take some tape and we're going to tape the battery to the rubberized foam strip. We're going to put that in our canvas bag. In this video, I'm not going to put the battery in the bag. I'm just going to show you with the battery sitting on the bike rack. Take your set of wires from the controller, and what we're going to do is we're either going to route the wires underneath the battery or on top, just depending on, we're going to find out what the best amount of space is. We're either going to run it above or we're going to run it below. So what you want to do is you want to take some wire and you want to give yourself enough wire that will go through this connector, and then give yourself a little bit of extra wire, because you can always tuck it inside the bag. You will always want to have a little extra wire, and then you want to run that up and size this out so it will tie in to your battery. Once we have that, we can then cut the wires, and then let's go ahead and reposition the camera, and I'll show you how we're going to solder these connectors on. So I now have my wire, and I've cut it a little bit longer. Again, you always want a little bit of extra wire. You don't want the wire pulled really taut through the case up to the bike rack. You want to always give yourself a little bit of extra slack, and that way, again, you can always tuck the extra in the bag on the bicycle rack or inside of the cover where your existing battery is. This video is getting a bit long, so we're going to end this video and we'll create another second video. So we'll see you in the next video. I will put a link in the description of several different batteries that you can purchase. The most important thing you want to remember is you want the voltage on the external battery to be very close, within 0.1 or 2 volts of the battery that's in the bike. The internal battery, when fully charged, should be right around 41 to 42 volts. So when you charge your external battery, it should also be between 41 and 42 volts. That way, when you connect both batteries together, there isn't going to be a disparity of voltage between the two batteries, which could cause a balancing condition where current from one battery charges to the other battery. You want the voltages between the two batteries to be very close to one another. Let's go ahead and solder our connections now. I've soldered the two XT60 connectors onto the pair of wires. I'll post another video that will teach you how to solder. If you see, I'm using clear heat shrink so you can actually see the soldering joints, just what I had lying around. As you notice, again, one set of wires has a male connector, the other set of wires has a female connector, and those will match up to the connectors between the controller and the external battery. Let's go ahead and connect the wires to the external battery and the controller, show you how that connects together. If you don't already have some, pick yourself up some zip ties. We're going to use these zip ties to connect the two wire pairs to inside the battery case, back to the externally mounted battery. So at the front end, you're going to have a male connector, so you want to find the female connector. Again, these connectors only go one way. Red to red, black to black. Make the connection at one end, and now what we can do is we can come in, get a zip tie. For the time being, we'll just rest those wires there. We'll tie them in and tuck them in later. We'll take another zip tie, pull the wires fairly taut together, zip tie about 6 inches down from the first zip tie. And as you can see, we can route the wires through the rear access hole coming out of the plastic cover. I'll take another zip tie, wrap it around some of the other wires going through the tubing of the e-bike, and then around the new wires that will lead to the external battery. As you can see, we can now route the batteries, in this case underneath the existing battery. Again, I made this harness purposely a little bit longer because I can always then tuck it inside the bag that's mounted to the external battery. In this example, I've routed the extra portion of the battery back around and tied it into the existing wires. That way I just have a short connection here to tie into the external battery. Again, you can either put it inside your bag, your waterproof bag that you put your battery in, or you can tuck it inside the plastic case where the primary battery is. Now we can take the other end of the XT60 connector and we could connect it in to the battery pack that we're using for the external battery. Now we made a connection. Now what we want to do is, before we tuck everything back in the cover, we want to do a little operational test on the batteries. Notice I've attached the tape to the foam pad underneath the battery, and if you want, you can then put it inside your canvas bag, and then you can attach the canvas bag to the bike rack either with a bungee cord or some other type of connector, and you just want to make sure that that battery isn't going to move around. So let's go ahead and do our operational test. I have the rear wheel and kickstand mounted up off the ground on just a piece of square tubing. That way I can rotate the throttle and check to make sure we're getting proper connection to the battery. Make sure the rear wheel turns via the motor. Operational check looks good. Now what we want to do is we want to tuck in the wires, mount your external battery to. Make sure you also tuck in your charging cord on the external battery. At this point I'm not going to put the cover on. I just want you to see how everything is routed.